Picture this. You're standing in a field somewhere in modern-day Turkey, and beneath your feet lies the remains of a civilization that mastered the art of war 3,000 years before gunpowder was even imagined. The Bronze Age wasn't just another chapter in our history books. It was humanity's first taste of true technological revolution, where the discovery of mixing copper and tin didn't just change how people made tools. It transformed entire societies, sparked the first global trade networks, and set the stage for conflicts that would make modern warfare look like child's play. We are looking at roughly 2,000 years of incredible innovation, epic battles, and the birth of civilizations that still influence our world today. This era spans from the gleaming palaces of Minoan Crete to the towering walls of Mycenaean citadels, from the bustling markets of Mesopotamian cities to the hidden workshops where the first bronze weapons were forged in secrecy. It is a time defined not just by survival, but by complexity, ambition, and the forging of the first great empires. But here's what makes this story truly captivating. The Bronze Age wasn't just about better tools and weapons. It was about the moment when human societies became interconnected on a scale never seen before. Tin from Cornwall found its way into bronze axes wielded by warriors in ancient Greece. Amber from the Baltic Sea adorned the necks of Egyptian pharaohs. Ideas, technologies, and cultures spread across vast distances, creating the world's first truly global civilization. This is the story of how a single technological breakthrough sparked a chain reaction that led to the rise and fall of empires. If you're fascinated by these forgotten chapters of our history, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our journey into the past. We will explore writing systems we still use today, trade routes that spanned thousands of miles, and the mystery of why these advanced civilizations simply vanished within a single generation. The Bronze Age begins not with a bang, but with a quiet revolution happening in workshops scattered across the ancient Near East around 3,300 BCE. For thousands of years, humans had been working with copper, hammering it into simple tools and ornaments. But copper had limitations. It was soft, difficult to keep sharp, and prone to bending under stress. Then someone, somewhere, made a discovery that would change everything. The exact moment is lost to history, but archaeological evidence suggests it happened independently in several locations. Perhaps it was an accident. A piece of tin ore accidentally mixed with copper during smelting. Perhaps it was deliberate experimentation by metalworkers who had noticed that certain copper ores produced stronger results. Whatever the case, the result was revolutionary. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, was harder, more durable, and capable of holding a much sharper edge than pure copper. But here's where the story gets interesting. Tin is remarkably rare compared to copper. While copper deposits can be found throughout the ancient world, tin sources were concentrated in just a few regions: Cornwall in Britain, parts of Spain, Bohemia in Central Europe, and scattered locations in Central Asia. This scarcity would prove to be both the driving force behind Bronze Age civilization and, ultimately, one of the factors in its collapse. The earliest evidence of true bronze working appears in the Caucasus region around 3,300 BCE, in sites like Shengavit in modern-day Armenia. Here, archaeologists have uncovered sophisticated bronze tools and weapons that demonstrate a clear understanding of alloy ratios. The metalworkers of this period weren't just randomly mixing metals. They had developed precise techniques for creating bronze with specific properties, adjusting tin content based on whether they were making tools, weapons, or decorative objects. From these early centers, bronze technology spread rapidly. By 3000 BCE, bronze working had reached Mesopotamia, where Sumerian craftsmen began producing increasingly sophisticated items. The royal cemetery at Ur, dating to around 2600 BCE, contained bronze weapons, tools, and ornaments of extraordinary quality. These weren't crude experimental pieces, but refined works of art that demonstrated centuries of technological development. The impact of bronze technology extended far beyond simple tool-making. Bronze weapons were sharper, stronger, and more reliable than their copper predecessors. A bronze sword could penetrate leather armor that would stop a copper blade. Bronze spearheads could pierce shields that copper points would merely dent. This technological advantage translated directly into military power, and military power translated into political control. The societies that first mastered bronze working found themselves with significant advantages over their neighbors. They could equip better armed warriors, produce more efficient agricultural tools, and create luxury goods that became symbols of power and status. This created a feedback loop where successful bronze-working societies could expand their territory, control more resources, and invest even more heavily in metallurgical development. But bronze technology also created new dependencies. Unlike the stone tools that had served humanity for millions of years, bronze required constant supplies of both copper and tin. A society might control rich copper deposits, but lack access to tin, making them dependent on trade networks that could span thousands of miles. This dependency would prove to be both the foundation of Bronze Age prosperity and the source of its ultimate vulnerability. The early Bronze Age, roughly from 3300 to 2100 BCE, witnessed the emergence of the first truly complex societies. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerian city-states developed sophisticated administrative systems to manage bronze production and distribution. Cuneiform tablets from this period contain detailed records of bronze workshops, listing the quantities of copper and tin required for different projects, the names of skilled metalworkers, and the distribution of finished products to warriors, officials, and traders. These records reveal a level of economic complexity that had never existed before. Bronze production required not just raw materials, but skilled labor, specialized tools, and organized distribution networks. A single bronze sword might involve copper miners in Cyprus, tin traders from Cornwall, charcoal producers from local forests, and specialized metalworkers who had trained for years to master their craft. The coordination required for such production encouraged the development of administrative bureaucracies, writing systems, and standardized weights and measures. The social implications were equally profound. Bronze weapons were expensive to produce and maintain, creating a military elite that could afford the best equipment. This technological divide reinforced social hierarchies and contributed to the emergence of warrior aristocracies that would dominate Bronze Age societies. The possession of bronze weapons became a marker of social status, and the ability to equip bronze-armed followers became a source of political power. Archaeological evidence from early Bronze Age sites reveals this growing social stratification. Burial sites from this period show clear distinctions between elite graves filled with bronze weapons, tools, and ornaments, and common graves containing few or no metal objects. The famous Amesbury archer, discovered near Stonehenge and dating to around 2300 BCE, was buried with copper knives, gold ornaments, and stone tools that originated from locations across Europe, suggesting he was part of a mobile elite that controlled long-distance trade networks. The technological demands of bronze production also spurred innovations in other fields. Bronze casting required precise temperature control, leading to improvements in furnace design and fuel management. The need for reliable supplies of tin encouraged advances in navigation and shipbuilding, as traders ventured ever farther in search of rare metals. Mining techniques advanced rapidly as societies sought to exploit deeper and more challenging ore deposits. One of the most significant developments of the early Bronze Age was the emergence of long-distance trade networks. The scarcity of tin forced bronze-working societies to establish trading relationships that spanned continents. Archaeological evidence reveals trade routes connecting Britain and Ireland with the Mediterranean, the Baltic with the Black Sea, and Central Asia with the Near East. These weren't simple chains of local exchanges, but sophisticated networks involving specialized traders, standardized currencies, and diplomatic agreements. The Uluburan shipwreck, discovered off the coast of Turkey and dating to around 1300 BCE, provides a remarkable snapshot of these Bronze Age trade networks. The ship's cargo included copper ingots from Cyprus, tin from Central Asia, amber from the Baltic, ivory from Africa, and luxury goods from across the Mediterranean. This single vessel carried materials and products from dozens of different cultures, demonstrating the truly international nature of Bronze Age commerce. These trade networks didn't just move raw materials and finished goods. They also facilitated the exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. Bronze working techniques spread along trade routes, but so did artistic styles, religious concepts, and political innovations. The early Bronze Age witnessed a remarkable homogenization of material culture across vast distances, as prestigious goods and the technologies to produce them spread throughout the interconnected world. The development of writing systems during this period was closely connected to the administrative needs of bronze production and trade. The earliest writing systems, from Sumerian cuneiform to Egyptian hieroglyphs, contain extensive records related to metallurgy and commerce. These weren't abstract intellectual exercises, but practical tools for managing the complex logistics of Bronze Age economies. Religious and ideological changes accompanied these technological and economic developments. Bronze weapons and tools often carried religious significance, with elaborate decoration and ritual contexts suggesting they were viewed as more than mere utilitarian objects. The skills required for bronze working were often associated with divine knowledge, and metalworkers frequently held special status within their societies. The early Bronze Age also witnessed significant changes in settlement patterns and urban development. The concentration of bronze production in specialized workshops encouraged the growth of larger settlements that could support diverse populations of craftsmen, traders, and administrators. Many Bronze Age cities were essentially organized around metallurgical production, with residential areas, workshops, and storage facilities arranged to facilitate the flow of materials and finished products. Military architecture evolved rapidly during this period, as the proliferation of bronze weapons necessitated new defensive strategies. The massive stone walls of early Bronze Age sites like Troy reflect the increased destructive potential of bronze-equipped armies. These fortifications weren't just larger versions of earlier defenses, but sophisticated military engineering designed to counter specific threats posed by bronze weapons and siege techniques. As we move deeper into the Bronze Age story, the technological revolution that began with simple copper and tin alloys would ultimately reshape every aspect of human civilization, setting the stage for both unprecedented prosperity and catastrophic collapse. The transformation of Bronze Age societies wasn't just about better weapons and tools. It fundamentally altered how humans organized themselves, thought about the world, and related to one another across vast distances. By 2500 BCE, the ripple effects of bronze technology had created something entirely new in human experience. Interconnected civilizations that rose and fell together, bound by invisible threads of trade, technology, and mutual dependence. Consider the island of Cyprus during the Middle Bronze Age, around 2000 BCE. This Mediterranean island had become the beating heart of the ancient world's economy, not because of its strategic location or agricultural wealth, but because it contained some of the richest copper deposits ever discovered. The mines at Skouria and other sites produced copper of such purity that it became the standard against which all other sources were measured. Cypriot copper ingots, shaped like ox hides and weighing exactly 29 kilograms, became a form of international currency that was recognized from Britain to Mesopotamia. But Cyprus's copper wealth came with a price. The island possessed virtually no tin, making it completely dependent on imports to produce bronze. This created a fascinating paradox. The source of the ancient world's most important bronze component couldn't actually make bronze without materials from thousands of miles away. Cypriot merchants became some of the most skilled navigators and traders of the ancient world, establishing trading posts from Spain to the Black Sea in their quest for the tin that would unlock their copper's true potential. The social implications of this dependency were profound. Cypriot society developed along lines that were utterly different from typical Bronze Age kingdoms. Rather than being dominated by warrior elites, Cyprus was ruled by merchant princes, whose power derived from their ability to maintain the complex trade relationships that kept bronze flowing. These weren't soldiers who had seized power through conquest, but businessmen whose authority rested on their understanding of markets, currencies, and logistics that spanned continents. Archaeological excavations at sites like Enkomi have revealed a society of extraordinary sophistication and cosmopolitan outlook. Cypriot craftsmen worked with materials from dozens of different cultures, creating hybrid art styles that blended influences from Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Aegean. Their workshops produced goods specifically designed for foreign markets, demonstrating an understanding of international consumer preferences that wouldn't look out of place in a modern global economy. The wealth generated by Cyprus's bronze trade transformed the island's landscape. Massive fortified cities arose seemingly overnight, their walls built not just for defense, but as symbols of prosperity that could be seen from far out at sea. The palace complexes at these sites weren't just royal residences, but international trading centers where merchants from across the known world gathered to negotiate deals that would determine the fate of kingdoms. Meanwhile, across the eastern Mediterranean, the Minoan civilization on Crete was developing its own unique response to Bronze Age opportunities. The Minoans created something unprecedented in human history. A maritime empire based not on military conquest, but on commercial dominance and technological innovation. Their approach to Bronze Age civilization was so different from their contemporaries that archaeologists initially refused to believe they could have existed. The Minoan palaces at Knossos, Phaistos, and Malea weren't fortified citadels designed to withstand siege warfare. They were open, sprawling complexes that seemed to welcome visitors rather than repel them. The famous frescoes that decorated these palaces depicted a society that celebrated luxury, artistic achievement, and international connections rather than military prowess. Minoan art shows dolphins leaping through azure seas, elegant courtiers engaged in mysterious rituals, and athletes performing death-defying acrobatic feats with sacred bulls. This wasn't naive pacifism, but calculated commercial strategy. The Minoans had recognized that Bronze Age prosperity depended on maintaining stable trade networks, and that military aggression disrupted the very relationships that generated wealth. Instead of armies, they deployed fleets of sophisticated ships that could carry larger cargoes farther and more safely than any of their competitors. Instead of conquest, they offered partnerships that made their trading partners wealthy enough to afford Minoan luxury goods. The Minoan approach to bronze technology reflected this commercial philosophy. While other civilizations focused on producing weapons and military equipment, Minoan craftsmen specialized in luxury items that showcased the artistic possibilities of bronze working. Their workshops produced intricate bronze vessels decorated with elaborate relief scenes, ceremonial weapons that were clearly intended for display rather than combat, and bronze sculptures that demonstrated technical mastery of the medium. But the Minoans' greatest innovation wasn't in bronze working itself, but in the systems they developed to manage Bronze Age complexity. They created the first known bureaucratic system designed specifically to handle international trade, with standardized record-keeping methods, quality control procedures, and inventory management techniques that allowed them to coordinate commercial activities across vast distances. The Linear A script found throughout Minoan sites appears to be primarily an accounting system, with tablets recording the movement of goods, the allocation of resources, and the obligations of various parties in complex trading relationships. While Linear A remains undeciphered, the patterns visible in surviving tablets suggest a level of commercial sophistication that wouldn't be matched again until the development of modern banking systems. The Minoan economy created wealth on a scale that had never been seen before. Palace storerooms contained enormous quantities of luxury goods from across the known world. Elephant ivory from Africa, amber from the Baltic, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and gold from Nubia. But these weren't just collections of exotic treasures. They were working inventories for a commercial system that turned raw materials into finished products for redistribution throughout the Mediterranean. The social structure that emerged from this commercial success was unlike anything that had existed before. Minoan society appears to have been relatively egalitarian, with wealth distributed much more evenly than in contemporary civilizations. Archaeological evidence suggests that even ordinary citizens had access to high-quality bronze tools, imported luxury goods, and sophisticated architectural amenities like indoor plumbing and decorative frescoes. Women held positions of unusual prominence in Minoan society, with artwork depicting female figures in positions of religious and political authority. The famous snake goddess figurines and frescoes showing women presiding over religious ceremonies suggest that Minoan culture valued different qualities than the warrior aristocracies that dominated most Bronze Age societies. This social organization wasn't just an interesting cultural variation, but a practical adaptation to Bronze Age economic realities. Commercial success required skills that weren't necessarily related to military prowess. Linguistic abilities for communicating with foreign traders, mathematical competence for managing complex transactions, and diplomatic skills for maintaining peaceful relationships with diverse trading partners. Minoan society appears to have been organized to reward these commercial virtues rather than traditional warrior values. The Minoan approach to international relations reflected this commercial orientation. Rather than demanding tribute from weaker neighbors or expanding through military conquest, they created networks of voluntary partnerships based on mutual economic benefit. Archaeological evidence suggests that Minoan trading posts throughout the Mediterranean operated more like modern embassies than colonial outposts, facilitating communication and commerce rather than extracting resources for the homeland. The success of this system was demonstrated by its longevity and geographic reach. For over 500 years, from roughly 2000 to 1500 BCE, Minoan commercial networks connected civilizations from Spain to Syria, creating the first truly global economy. Minoan pottery has been found at archaeological sites throughout Europe, Africa, and Asia, while Minoan artistic influences can be seen in the decorative traditions of dozens of different cultures. But the Minoan system also contained the seeds of its own vulnerability. Their success had made them essential to Bronze Age civilization, but it had also made them dependent on the continued stability of the very networks they had created. Unlike military empires that could survive through force, even when their economies faltered, the Minoan system required voluntary cooperation from hundreds of different trading partners. As we'll discover, this dependency would prove catastrophic when Bronze Age civilization faced its ultimate crisis. But during their golden age, the Minoans had demonstrated something remarkable: that human societies could organize themselves around cooperation rather than conquest, and that commercial relationships could create prosperity on a scale that military force alone could never achieve. The Minoan achievement was all the more remarkable because it occurred during a period when most of their neighbors were developing in exactly the opposite direction, creating increasingly militarized societies built around bronze weapons and warrior elites. The contrast between Minoan commercial civilization and its contemporaries becomes starkly apparent when we examine the explosive rise of the Mycenaean Greeks, who would ultimately prove that military power could indeed triumph over commercial sophistication, at least in the short term. Around 1600 BCE, while Minoan merchants were perfecting their peaceful trading networks, a very different Bronze Age society was emerging on the Greek mainland that would fundamentally challenge the Minoan model of civilization. The Mycenaeans represented everything the Minoans were not. Where Minoan palaces welcomed visitors with open courtyards and colourful frescoes, Mycenaean citadels glowered from hilltops behind massive stone walls that could withstand months of siege warfare. Where Minoan art celebrated dolphins and flowers, Mycenaean decorations featured warriors in bronze armour, hunting wild boars, and driving horse-drawn chariots into battle. Where Minoan society appears to have valued commercial success and artistic achievement, Mycenaean culture was built around a simple principle: the man with the best bronze weapons rules. But the Mycenaeans weren't primitive barbarians who stumbled upon bronze technology and used it to terrorize their more civilized neighbors. They were sophisticated strategists who had carefully studied the Bronze Age world and identified its fundamental weakness. All of those peaceful trading networks, all of that commercial prosperity, all of those beautiful palaces filled with luxury goods existed only as long as someone was willing and able to protect them. The Minoans had created wealth on an unprecedented scale, but they had never seriously considered what would happen if someone decided to simply take that wealth by force. Archaeological evidence from sites like Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos reveals a society that was organized from the ground up for warfare. The famous Lion Gate at Mycenae wasn't just defensive architecture, but psychological warfare, designed to intimidate potential enemies with its massive scale and aggressive imagery. The cyclopean walls that surrounded these citadels were engineering marvels that represented investments of labor and resources that could only be justified by serious military threats. But perhaps most tellingly, Mycenaean palaces were built around Megaron halls, where the king held court surrounded by his warrior companions. These weren't commercial centers designed to facilitate trade, but military headquarters where strategic decisions were made and where loyalty was rewarded with bronze weapons and shares of plunder. The Linear B tablets found at these sites contain detailed inventories of military equipment, lists of troops and their assignments, and records of tribute payments from subject territories. The Mycenaean approach to bronze technology reflected their military priorities. While Minoan craftsmen had focused on luxury goods and artistic objects, Mycenaean workshops mass-produced weapons and armor with an efficiency that foreshadowed modern military-industrial complexes. Archaeological excavations have uncovered bronze weapon caches containing hundreds of spearheads, sword blades, and arrowheads, all produced according to standardized specifications that allowed for rapid deployment and easy replacement. The famous bronze armor found in Mycenaean graves wasn't just protective equipment, but status symbols that communicated the wearer's position within a rigid military hierarchy. The Dendra panoply, a complete set of bronze armor dating to around 1400 BCE, required over 30 kilograms of bronze and represented an investment equivalent to several years of agricultural production. Only the highest-ranking warriors could afford such equipment, and possession of it marked them as members of an elite fighting class that dominated Mycenaean society. This military focus extended to Mycenaean maritime activities, which were organized more like naval expeditions than commercial ventures. Mycenaean ships were designed to carry warriors and their equipment rather than maximize cargo capacity for peaceful trade. The distinctive Mycenaean pottery found throughout the Mediterranean wasn't just evidence of commercial exchange, but markers of military campaigns and territorial expansion. The transformation of the Aegean world began around 1450 BCE, when Mycenaean forces launched what appears to have been a coordinated assault on Minoan civilization. The archaeological record from this period tells a dramatic story of sudden destruction and cultural transformation. Minoan palaces were burned, their archives destroyed, and their administrative systems dismantled. But this wasn't random destruction motivated by barbarian hatred of civilization. The Mycenaeans had studied Minoan society carefully and understood exactly what they were destroying. They systematically eliminated the commercial and administrative systems that had made Minoan prosperity possible while preserving the infrastructure and skilled craftsmen they needed to maintain their own power. Minoan artisans found themselves working for new masters who valued their technical skills but had very different priorities for how those skills should be employed. The takeover of Crete marked the beginning of what archaeologists call the Mycenaean Koine period, when Mycenaean cultural influence spread throughout the eastern Mediterranean. But this wasn't the gradual diffusion of ideas and techniques that had characterized earlier Bronze Age expansion. This was cultural imperialism backed by bronze weapons and implemented through military force. Mycenaean expansion followed a consistent pattern that would be repeated throughout the late Bronze Age. First, Mycenaean warriors would establish military bases at strategic locations, often on islands or coastal sites that could be easily defended and supplied by sea. These bases served as launching points for raids against local populations and as secure storage facilities for plunder and tribute. Once local resistance had been eliminated or neutralized, Mycenaean administrators would establish tributary relationships that extracted wealth from subject populations while providing just enough security to maintain productive capacity. The Linear B tablets from Pylos contain detailed records of these arrangements, listing the obligations of various communities to provide specific quantities of bronze, livestock, textiles, and other goods to their Mycenaean overlords. The efficiency of this system was demonstrated by its rapid expansion throughout the Aegean and beyond. Within 2 centuries of their conquest of Crete, Mycenaean influence extended from the Black Sea to Sicily, from the Danube to the Nile Delta. Mycenaean pottery, weapons, and administrative techniques have been found at hundreds of archaeological sites, testimony to the reach of their military and economic networks. But the Mycenaean system contained contradictions that would ultimately prove fatal. Their success depended on maintaining military superiority over their subjects, which required constant investment in weapons, fortifications, and professional warriors. This created an enormous economic burden that could only be sustained through continuous expansion and exploitation of new territories. The Mycenaean elite lived lives of extraordinary luxury that reflected the wealth their military system generated. The shaft graves at Mycenae contained gold death masks, bronze weapons decorated with precious metals, and luxury goods from across the known world. The famous Mask of Agamemnon, while probably dating to an earlier period than the legendary king, represents the kind of wealth that Mycenaean military success could generate for those at the top of the social hierarchy. Yet this luxury came at a tremendous cost to the broader population. Archaeological evidence suggests that ordinary Mycenaeans lived in conditions that were significantly worse than their Minoan predecessors, with smaller houses, fewer luxury goods, and more restricted access to imported materials. The Mycenaean system concentrated wealth in the hands of a warrior elite, while reducing most of the population to a subsistence level that could barely support the military apparatus that protected them. The internal structure of Mycenaean society reflected this military focus in every aspect of daily life. Children were trained from an early age for their future roles within the military hierarchy, with boys learning weapons handling and girls learning the domestic skills needed to support warrior households. Education focused on practical military and administrative skills, rather than the artistic and commercial abilities that had flourished under Minoan civilization. Religious practices became militarized as well, with gods and goddesses taking on increasingly warlike characteristics. The Linear B tablets contain references to weapons being dedicated to various deities, and archaeological evidence suggests that religious ceremonies often involve displays of military equipment and competitive martial events. The Mycenaean transformation of Bronze Age civilization represented more than just a change in political control. It demonstrated that the technological advantages of bronze could be used to create very different kinds of societies with very different values and priorities. Where the Minoans had used bronze technology to create wealth through commerce, the Mycenaeans used it to concentrate power through conquest. This fundamental difference in approach would have profound consequences for the future of Bronze Age civilization. The Mycenaean model proved that military force could indeed triumph over commercial sophistication, but it also created a much more fragile and unstable form of society that would prove vulnerable to the catastrophic events that were already beginning to unfold across the wider Bronze Age world. As Mycenaean power reached its peak around 1300 BCE, the seeds of Bronze Age collapse were already being sown by forces that neither Minoan commerce nor Mycenaean military might would prove capable of controlling. The world that the Mycenaeans had conquered through bronze and blood was far larger and more complex than even they fully understood. As their warriors celebrated victories in palaces built on Minoan ruins, vast forces were already in motion across the Bronze Age world that would ultimately render their military supremacy meaningless. The very success of Bronze Age civilization had created dependencies and vulnerabilities that no amount of bronze weaponry could protect against. By 1300 BCE, the Bronze Age world had become a delicate ecosystem of interdependent civilizations, stretching from the Atlantic coasts of Europe to the mountains of Afghanistan. The Hittite Empire controlled the crucial land routes between Europe and Asia from their capital at Hattusa in central Anatolia. Egyptian pharaohs ruled the Nile Valley and commanded trade networks that extended deep into Africa and across the Red Sea to the mysterious land of Punt. Assyrian merchants operated trading posts from the Black Sea to the Persian Gulf, while Babylonian mathematicians calculated the movements of planets with precision that wouldn't be matched again for over 1,000 years. Each of these civilizations had developed unique solutions to the challenges of Bronze Age life, but all of them shared fundamental dependencies that made their apparent strength an illusion. The Hittites controlled rich iron deposits in their Anatolian heartland, but they needed tin from Central Asia and copper from Cyprus to maintain their bronze-working industries. Egypt possessed gold in abundance, but lacked the tin and copper necessary for bronze production. Mesopotamian cities could produce sophisticated finished goods, but required raw materials from across the known world to keep their workshops operating. The complexity of these relationships had reached levels that strained the administrative capabilities of Bronze Age governments. The archives at Hattusa contain thousands of cuneiform tablets documenting diplomatic correspondence, trade agreements, and military alliances that stretched across continents. Hittite kings exchanged letters with Egyptian pharaohs, Mycenaean warlords, and Assyrian merchants in a constant effort to maintain the relationships that kept bronze flowing to their workshops and warriors. These diplomatic archives reveal a world that was becoming increasingly unstable as competing powers struggled to control the same limited resources. The famous correspondence between the Hittite king Hattusili III and the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II documents lengthy negotiations over territorial boundaries, trade routes, and marriage alliances that were essential to maintaining peace between two powers that desperately needed each other's cooperation, but could never fully trust each other's intentions. The Amarna letters, discovered in the ruins of Akhenaten's short-lived capital in Egypt, provide an even more detailed picture of Bronze Age international relations. These diplomatic archives contain correspondence from rulers throughout the Near East, written in Akkadian cuneiform that had become the international language of Bronze Age diplomacy. The letters reveal a world where even minor local conflicts could disrupt trade networks that spanned thousands of miles, where diplomatic marriages between royal families were essential to maintaining commercial relationships, and where the failure of a single harvest could trigger military campaigns across multiple continents. But perhaps most tellingly, these archives document the growing frequency of what the ancient texts describe as difficult times and years of confusion. References to bandits disrupting trade routes, rebellions in remote provinces, and mysterious sea peoples raiding coastal settlements appear with increasing frequency in documents from the 13th and 12th centuries BCE. These weren't isolated local problems, but symptoms of systemic stress affecting the entire Bronze Age world. The root of this instability lay in contradictions that were built into Bronze Age civilization itself. The very success of bronze technology had created a world where prosperity depended on maintaining complex relationships across vast distances. But the military power that bronze weapons provided encouraged conflicts that disrupted those same relationships. Every Bronze Age empire was caught in this fundamental paradox. They needed peaceful trade to obtain the materials for bronze production, but they needed military force to protect their trade networks and extract tribute from subject populations. The Hittite Empire exemplified these contradictions. From their mountain strongholds in central Anatolia, Hittite armies could dominate the land routes between Europe and Asia, extracting tribute from caravans carrying tin from Central Asia to workshops in the Mediterranean. But this military control required enormous investments in fortifications, professional armies, and administrative bureaucracies that consumed much of the wealth that their strategic position generated. Hittite society had become a military machine that existed primarily to sustain itself. The kingdom was organized around a feudal system where local nobles provided military service in exchange for land grants and shares of tribute. Hittite law codes contained detailed provisions for military obligations, specifying exactly how many warriors each landowner must provide for royal campaigns and what equipment they must supply for their followers. The capital at Hattusa reflected this military focus in every aspect of its design. The city was protected by massive stone walls, punctuated by elaborate gates decorated with relief sculptures of warriors and mythical beasts. The royal palace complex included arsenals for storing weapons, barracks for housing professional soldiers, and archives for maintaining the records necessary to coordinate military campaigns across the empire's vast territories. But the most revealing aspect of Hittite civilization was its approach to religion, which had become thoroughly militarized. Hittite gods were primarily warrior deities whose favor was sought through offerings of captured weapons and promises of future conquests. The famous rock sanctuary at Yazilikaya depicts the entire Hittite pantheon as an army of divine warriors marching in military formation, reflecting a society where even religious concepts had been subordinated to military concerns. This militarization extended to Hittite interactions with their neighbors, who were viewed primarily as either allies to be recruited for military campaigns or enemies to be conquered and exploited. The Hittites developed sophisticated diplomatic techniques for managing their relationships with other Bronze Age powers. But these relationships were always fundamentally based on calculations of military advantage rather than genuine cooperation. The Egyptian approach to Bronze Age challenges was subtly different, but equally dependent on military force to maintain the commercial relationships that sustained their civilization. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom had transformed Egypt from an isolated African civilization into the dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean through a series of military campaigns that brought vast wealth flowing into the Nile Valley. Egyptian armies under pharaohs like Thutmose III and Rameses II had conquered territories extending from Nubia in the south to the Euphrates River in the north, creating an empire that controlled crucial trade routes and extracted tribute from dozens of subject peoples. The wealth generated by this imperial system funded the construction of massive temple complexes at Karnak and Luxor, supported elaborate court ceremonies that amazed foreign ambassadors, and financed military expeditions that brought exotic goods and prisoners back to Egypt. But Egyptian prosperity was built on foundations that were ultimately unsustainable. The empire required constant military campaigns to maintain control over distant territories, while the elaborate ceremonial and religious obligations of pharaonic kingship consumed enormous resources that might otherwise have been invested in economic development. Most critically, Egypt's agricultural system, despite its legendary fertility, could not support both a large military establishment and the massive construction projects that demonstrated royal power to foreign observers. The famous scenes carved on temple walls at Abu Simbel and other sites show Ramesses II receiving tribute from foreign peoples, but these artistic celebrations of imperial success masked growing economic strains that Egyptian records reveal with increasing clarity. Tax collection became more difficult as distant provinces grew restive under Egyptian rule, while the costs of maintaining garrisons and administrative centers throughout the empire continued to escalate. Egyptian society had become dependent on imperial wealth to maintain standards of living that could not be supported by domestic production alone. The comfortable houses of Memphis and Thebes were filled with luxury goods imported from across the known world, while Egyptian artisans worked with raw materials that traveled thousands of miles to reach their workshops. When this flow of imperial wealth was disrupted, the entire Egyptian economic system would prove vulnerable to rapid collapse. Meanwhile, in the mountains and steppes beyond the reach of Bronze Age empires, very different societies were developing that would ultimately prove immune to the vulnerabilities that plagued their more civilized neighbors. These were peoples who had learned to use bronze technology without becoming dependent on the complex trade networks and administrative systems that sustained Bronze Age civilization. The Indo-European migrations that had been reshaping the ethnic map of Europe and Asia for over a millennium were entering a new phase that would bring these peripheral peoples into direct contact with the established Bronze Age powers. These weren't primitive barbarians stumbling blindly towards civilization, but sophisticated societies that had developed alternative approaches to Bronze Age technology and social organization. Some of these groups, like the ancestors of the Celts in Central and Western Europe, had mastered bronze working techniques that allowed them to create weapons and tools of extraordinary quality without depending on long-distance trade for essential materials. They had discovered local sources of tin and copper, developed alternative alloys that performed as well as traditional bronze, and created social institutions that could support skilled metallurgy without the elaborate bureaucracies that characterized Bronze Age empires. Other groups had developed military technologies and tactics that could neutralize the advantages of traditional Bronze Age armies. The horse-riding peoples of the Eurasian steppes had perfected techniques of mounted warfare that gave them unprecedented mobility and striking power. Their bronze weapons were specifically designed for use from horseback, while their social organization allowed them to coordinate military operations across vast distances without the communication systems that Bronze Age empires required. These developments were creating a fundamentally new military situation that existing Bronze Age powers were slow to recognize. For over 1,000 years, military superiority had belonged to societies that could afford the most bronze weapons and the most elaborate fortifications. But mounted warriors, armed with bronze-tipped arrows, could strike targets hundreds of miles from their bases and disappear before traditional armies could respond. The established Bronze Age powers found themselves facing threats that their military systems had never been designed to handle. Their massive stone fortifications were useless against enemies who had no intention of conducting siege warfare. Their professional armies, trained for set-piece battles between bronze-equipped infantry forces, were helpless against mounted archers who refused to stand and fight according to traditional rules of warfare. But perhaps most importantly, these new military challenges were emerging at precisely the moment when Bronze Age civilization was becoming increasingly vulnerable to disruption. The complex trade networks that sustained Bronze Age prosperity had grown so elaborate and interdependent that the failure of any single component could trigger cascading collapses throughout the system. Climate records from this period reveal that the 13th and 12th centuries BCE witnessed significant environmental changes that put additional stress on Bronze Age societies. Tree ring data from across Europe and the Mediterranean indicate periods of reduced rainfall that would have affected agricultural production and water supplies. Volcanic activity during this period may have caused temporary climate disruptions that reduced crop yields across large regions. These environmental pressures came at the worst possible time for civilizations that had organized themselves around military expansion and imperial exploitation, rather than sustainable economic development. Bronze Age empires had grown dependent on extracting surplus wealth from agricultural populations, but climate stress was reducing the surpluses available for extraction while simultaneously increasing the costs of maintaining military control over restive subjects. The stage was being set for what archaeologists would later call the Bronze Age collapse, but the rulers of Hattusa and Memphis, Mycenae and Babylon were still focused on traditional concerns about territorial boundaries, trade agreements, and military campaigns against familiar enemies. They could not yet see that their entire world was about to be transformed by forces that no amount of bronze weapons or diplomatic skill would prove capable of controlling. The first signs of systemic crisis appeared not in the great capitals, but in the remote outposts, where Bronze Age civilization met the wider world. Places where the early warnings of impending catastrophe went unheeded by rulers whose attention was focused on more immediate concerns closer to home. The collapse began quietly, almost imperceptibly, in places so remote from the great centers of Bronze Age power that their destruction barely registered in the royal archives. Around 1200 BCE, trading posts along the Black Sea coast simply stopped sending their regular shipments of goods. Hittite administrators noted the disruption in their records, but attributed it to local rebellions or temporary difficulties with tribal peoples. Egyptian scribes recorded the failure of tribute deliveries from Syrian territories, but assumed these were isolated problems that could be resolved through the usual combination of diplomacy and military pressure. But these weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a systemic breakdown that was spreading like a plague throughout the interconnected world of Bronze Age civilization. The very trade networks that had made Bronze Age prosperity possible were now becoming transmission routes for economic and social collapse. When one link in the chain failed, the effects rippled outward with devastating speed, disrupting relationships and dependencies that had taken centuries to establish. The crisis manifested differently in different regions, but everywhere it followed the same basic pattern. Local populations, faced with increasing demands for tribute and military service from distant rulers, began to abandon their settlements and migrate toward areas that promised greater security or opportunity. These population movements disrupted agricultural production and local craft industries, reducing the surplus wealth available to support Bronze Age administrative systems and military establishments. Archaeological evidence from this period tells a story of systematic abandonment rather than dramatic military conquest. Sites throughout the eastern Mediterranean show signs of careful evacuation rather than sudden destruction, with valuable objects removed and storage facilities emptied before abandonment. This wasn't the chaotic flight of populations fleeing invading armies, but the deliberate dissolution of communities that had concluded their existing way of life was no longer sustainable. The refugees created by these abandonments didn't simply disappear. They formed mobile populations that moved throughout the Bronze Age world, seeking new opportunities for settlement and survival. Some groups maintained their traditional occupations as craftsmen, traders, or farmers, offering their skills to communities that could provide security and resources. Others turned to raiding and piracy, using bronze weapons and naval skills acquired during the prosperous centuries to prey upon the very trade networks they had once served. Contemporary Egyptian records refer to these mobile populations as the Sea Peoples, a designation that reflects Egyptian confusion about groups whose origins and intentions they couldn't understand. The Egyptian scribes who recorded encounters with these peoples described them using ethnic names that archaeologists have struggled to identify. Peleset, Cheka, Shekelesh, Denyen, Weshesh. These weren't traditional enemy nations with fixed territories and familiar political structures, but fluid coalitions of displaced populations united primarily by their exclusion from the failing Bronze Age system. The Sea Peoples represented something entirely new in Bronze Age warfare. enemies who had nothing to lose and no fixed assets that could be targeted for retaliation. Traditional Bronze Age military strategies were designed for conflicts between established powers, with territories to defend and populations to protect. But how do you negotiate with refugees? How do you deter raiders who have already lost their homes? How do you defeat enemies whose greatest advantage is their mobility and whose primary weapon is the desperation of people with no other options? The Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses III left detailed records of his encounters with Sea Peoples coalitions that attacked Egypt's delta territories around 1180 BCE. His inscriptions at Medinet Habu describe massive naval battles where Egyptian forces struggled to defend fixed positions against enemies who could strike anywhere along hundreds of miles of coastline. The Egyptian artists who carved these scenes showed Egyptian ships fighting vessels of unfamiliar design, carrying warriors whose equipment and tactics differed markedly from traditional Bronze Age military practice. But perhaps most tellingly, Ramesses III's records indicate that these weren't simple raiding expeditions seeking plunder and quick withdrawal. The Sea Peoples were moving with their families, their possessions, and their livestock, seeking new territories where they could establish permanent settlements. These were migrations of entire peoples who had been displaced by the breakdown of Bronze Age civilization and were now seeking to carve out new homes from the ruins of the old world. The Hittite response to similar pressures reveals the fundamental weakness of Bronze Age imperial systems when confronted with this new type of threat. Hittite armies were designed for campaigns against enemy kingdoms with capitals to capture and territories to occupy. But the groups now threatening Hittite territories couldn't be defeated through traditional conquest because they had no central authority to negotiate with and no fixed territories to occupy. Hittite records from the reign of Tudhaliya IV describe increasingly desperate attempts to maintain control over territories that were being systematically abandoned by their populations. Royal decrees commanded local officials to prevent emigration and ordered the return of displaced persons to their original settlements. But these administrative solutions proved powerless against the economic and social forces that were driving population movements. The final Hittite king, Suppiluliuma II, left records that document the complete breakdown of imperial administration throughout much of Anatolia. Provincial governors stopped sending tribute and responding to royal commands. Major cities were abandoned as their populations fled toward regions that seemed to offer greater security. The elaborate bureaucratic system that had once coordinated activities across the empire simply ceased to function as the underlying economic relationships it managed dissolved. The destruction of Hattusa itself around 1180 BCE marked the end of the Hittite Empire. But archaeological evidence suggests this wasn't the result of a dramatic siege or military conquest. The city appears to have been systematically dismantled by its own inhabitants, who removed valuable objects and useful materials before setting fires that destroyed the remaining wooden structures. This was controlled demolition rather than enemy action. The final act of a civilization that had concluded its own way of life was no longer viable. Similar patterns of systematic abandonment characterized the collapse of Mycenaean civilization in Greece. The great citadels that had dominated the Aegean world for centuries were evacuated and destroyed not by foreign invaders, but by their own populations. Linear B tablets from the final period of Mycenaean civilization document desperate attempts by palace administrators to maintain control over dwindling resources and shrinking territories. The tablets from Pylos, dating to the very end of Mycenaean civilization around 1180 BCE, record frantic preparations for military campaigns that were apparently never launched. Inventories list bronze weapons being distributed to local officials, coastal watchtowers being manned against seaborne threats, and tribute assessments being revised downward as subject territories stopped providing their expected contributions. But the most revealing aspect of these final Mycenaean records is what they don't contain. There are no references to major enemy forces threatening the kingdom, no records of diplomatic negotiations with hostile powers, no accounts of military defeats that might explain the civilization's sudden collapse. Instead, The tablets document an administrative system that was simply running out of resources and losing control over the population it was supposed to govern. The abandonment of Mycenaean palaces wasn't random destruction, but selective demolition that preserved some structures while destroying others. Archaeological evidence suggests that departing populations systematically destroyed administrative centers and storage facilities while leaving residential areas and workshops largely intact. This pattern indicates that the collapse wasn't motivated by hatred of Mycenaean culture, but by rejection of the specific political and economic arrangements that Mycenaean palaces represented. The refugees created by Mycenaean collapse didn't simply vanish, but contributed to the population movements that were reshaping the entire Eastern Mediterranean. Some groups maintained their Bronze Age cultural traditions while adapting to new circumstances, establishing settlements in Cyprus, southern Italy, and other regions where they could continue their traditional occupations under different political arrangements. Other former Mycenaeans appear to have joined the Sea Peoples coalitions that were disrupting Bronze Age civilization throughout the region. Egyptian records describe some Sea Peoples groups using weapons and ship designs that were clearly derived from Mycenaean traditions, while archaeological evidence suggests that former Mycenaean territories served as staging areas for Sea Peoples activities in the Eastern Mediterranean. The transformation of Bronze Age refugees into Sea Peoples raiders illustrates one of the most significant aspects of the Bronze Age collapse. This wasn't simply the destruction of existing civilizations, but their metamorphosis into something entirely different. The skills, technologies, and cultural traditions of Bronze Age civilization didn't disappear, but were adapted to serve new purposes under radically different circumstances. The bronze working techniques that had once produced luxury goods for palace elites were now employed to create weapons for displaced warriors seeking new homes. The maritime technologies that had once facilitated peaceful trade were now used for piracy and amphibious assault. The administrative skills that had once managed complex imperial bureaucracies were now applied to coordinating the movements of refugee populations across vast distances. This transformation reveals one of the fundamental characteristics of the Bronze Age collapse. Rather than being simply destroyed by external enemies, Bronze Age civilization was torn apart by internal contradictions that made it vulnerable to pressures it couldn't accommodate. The very success of Bronze Age technology and organization had created dependencies and rigidities that prevented adaptation to changing circumstances. The Egyptian kingdom, despite its apparent stability during this period of widespread collapse, was also experiencing severe internal strains that would ultimately prove fatal to Bronze Age civilization in the Nile Valley. Ramesses III's victories over the Sea Peoples came at enormous cost that Egypt's economy could barely sustain. The resources devoted to military campaigns and coastal defenses reduced the investments available for maintaining the irrigation systems and agricultural infrastructure that supported Egyptian prosperity. More critically, the disruption of international trade networks deprived Egypt of many of the raw materials that had become essential to Egyptian civilization. The bronze workshops of Memphis and Thebes fell silent as tin shipments from distant sources ceased to arrive. Egyptian craftsmen found themselves unable to produce the luxury goods that had once demonstrated pharaonic power to foreign observers and domestic subjects alike. The psychological impact of these material shortages may have been even more significant than their economic effects. For centuries, Egyptian ideology had portrayed the pharaoh as a divine king, whose cosmic authority ensured the prosperity and security of the Nile Valley. But how could royal divinity be maintained when the king could no longer provide his subjects with the bronze tools and weapons they had come to expect? Egyptian records from the reigns of Ramesses III's successors document increasing social unrest and economic difficulty throughout the kingdom. Strike records from the royal necropolis, workers at Deir el-Medina, describe craftsmen refusing to work when their rations of grain and other supplies were reduced or delayed. These weren't political protests, but desperate actions by skilled workers who could no longer support their families under the existing economic arrangements. The gradual abandonment of Egyptian territories in Syria and Palestine during this period reflected not just military weakness, but economic necessity. Egypt simply could no longer afford to maintain the garrisons, administrative centers, and supply networks required to control distant territories. The tribute that these territories had once provided was no longer sufficient to cover the costs of maintaining imperial control over them. As Egyptian power contracted toward the Nile Valley itself, the kingdom lost access to the trade networks that had connected Egypt to the broader Bronze Age world. This isolation accelerated the process of cultural and technological stagnation that would characterize Egypt during the centuries following the Bronze Age collapse. Without access to foreign innovations and materials, Egyptian civilization turned increasingly inward, developing the conservative and tradition-bound characteristics that would define it throughout later periods. The collapse of Bronze Age civilization wasn't a sudden catastrophe, but a gradual process of system failure that unfolded over several generations. Each component of the Bronze Age world had been dependent on relationships with other components that were themselves becoming increasingly unstable. When these relationships began to fail, the effects cascaded throughout the entire system with inexorable logic. By 1150 BCE, the great Bronze Age empires had either collapsed entirely or contracted to small territories around their original heartlands. The trade networks that had connected Britain to Afghanistan lay in ruins, disrupted by political instability, population movements, and economic breakdown. The sophisticated urban civilizations that had dominated the Eastern Mediterranean for over a millennium had been replaced by smaller, simpler societies that could survive without the complex international relationships that Bronze Age prosperity had required. Yet the Bronze Age collapse wasn't simply an ending, but also a beginning. From the ruins of Bronze Age, civilization would emerge new peoples, new technologies, and new forms of social organization that would ultimately prove more adaptable and resilient than their Bronze Age predecessors. The skills and knowledge developed during the Bronze Age weren't lost, but were preserved, modified, and transmitted to successor civilizations that would build upon Bronze Age achievements while avoiding the dependencies and vulnerabilities that had made Bronze Age collapse inevitable. The story of how humanity recovered from this civilizational catastrophe and created new forms of technological and social organization would prove to be one of the most remarkable chapters in human history, demonstrating that even the most devastating collapses could become opportunities for innovation and renewal. The silence that followed the Bronze Age collapse was not the silence of death, but the silence of transformation. Across the Mediterranean and beyond, in places where great palaces had once buzzed with administrative activity and where bronze workshops had once rung with the sound of hammers on metal, new forms of life were quietly taking root. These weren't the grand civilizations of the Bronze Age with their international trade networks and imperial bureaucracies, but something entirely different. Communities that had learned to thrive without depending on the complex systems that had made their predecessors so vulnerable. In the mountains of Anatolia, where Hittite kings had once commanded armies that could march from the Black Sea to the borders of Egypt, small villages were developing innovations that would ultimately prove more durable than any imperial conquest. These communities had inherited bronze-working techniques from their Hittite predecessors, but they were experimenting with something that Bronze Age craftsmen had largely ignored: iron. Iron ore was far more common than the tin required for bronze production, and it could be found in local deposits that didn't require international trade networks to access. The early ironworking techniques developed in these Anatolian villages were crude compared to the sophisticated bronze technologies of the collapsed empires, but they had one crucial advantage. They could be practiced by communities that were completely self-sufficient in raw materials. The transition from bronze to iron wasn't immediate or uniform. For several generations, iron tools remained inferior to their bronze counterparts in most practical applications. Early iron was softer than good bronze, more prone to corrosion, and required different techniques for shaping and maintenance. But ironworkers gradually discovered methods for improving their product through controlled heating, quenching, and the addition of carbon to create what we now know as steel. These metallurgical innovations were spreading through networks that operated very differently from the grand trade routes of the Bronze Age. Instead of official diplomatic missions carrying luxury goods between royal courts, knowledge was now transmitted by individual craftsmen, refugees, and merchants who travelled light and adapted quickly to local conditions. A blacksmith who had learned new techniques in one village might carry that knowledge hundreds of miles before settling in a new community and training local apprentices in his methods. The social implications of iron technology were profound. Bronze working had required large-scale organization to coordinate the acquisition of tin and copper from distant sources, encouraging the development of centralized political systems that could manage complex international relationships. But iron could be worked by individual craftsmen using local materials, making it possible for smaller communities to achieve technological independence that had been impossible during the Bronze Age. This technological shift coincided with equally significant changes in agricultural and social organization. The population movements that had accompanied the Bronze Age collapse had mixed peoples from different cultural backgrounds, creating hybrid communities that combined traditions and techniques from multiple sources. These new societies often developed more flexible and adaptable institutions than their Bronze Age predecessors, precisely because they couldn't rely on established traditions or inherited advantages. In Greece, the descendants of Mycenaean refugees were creating settlements that bore little resemblance to the great citadels of the Bronze Age. These new communities were smaller, less hierarchical, and more focused on local self-sufficiency than international trade. But they were also developing cultural innovations that would ultimately prove more influential than anything achieved by Mycenaean civilization. The most significant of these innovations was the development of alphabetic writing systems that were far simpler and more flexible than the complex syllabic scripts used by Bronze Age bureaucracies. Linear B, the writing system used in Mycenaean palaces, required extensive training to master and was primarily used for administrative record-keeping by professional scribes. But the new alphabetic systems being developed in post-Bronze Age Greece could be learned by ordinary citizens and used for a much wider range of purposes. This democratization of literacy had far-reaching consequences for political and social development. When writing was controlled by professional scribes working for palace administrations, it reinforced centralized authority and bureaucratic control. But when ordinary citizens could read and write, they could participate more directly in political decisions and cultural activities that had previously been monopolized by elite classes. The Greek communities that emerged from Bronze Age collapse were also experimenting with new forms of political organization that distributed power more widely than the monarchical systems that had dominated Bronze Age civilization. These weren't democracies in the modern sense, but they represented significant steps toward more participatory forms of government that could adapt more quickly to changing circumstances than the rigid imperial systems of their predecessors. Similar innovations were occurring throughout the former Bronze Age world, as communities developed solutions to the challenges of life without imperial protection or international trade networks. In Phoenicia, the descendants of Bronze Age coastal peoples were creating maritime trading networks that operated on entirely different principles from their predecessors. Instead of imperial tribute systems that extracted wealth from subject territories, Phoenician merchants developed commercial relationships based on mutual benefit and voluntary exchange. Phoenician trading posts weren't military bases designed to control territory, but commercial centers that provided services to local populations while facilitating long-distance trade. This approach proved remarkably successful, allowing Phoenician merchants to establish networks that eventually extended from the Atlantic coasts of Spain and Morocco to the mountains of Afghanistan, far beyond the geographic reach of any Bronze Age empire. The technologies that made Phoenician expansion possible were often simpler than their Bronze Age equivalents, but they were also more reliable and easier to maintain. Phoenician ships were smaller than the great vessels that had carried Bronze Age luxury goods, but they were also more seaworthy and could be repaired using materials available at any port. Phoenician navigation techniques relied on practical knowledge of winds, currents, and celestial patterns, rather than the elaborate astronomical calculations developed by Bronze Age court astronomers. Perhaps most importantly, Phoenician communities developed cultural and religious practices that could adapt to local conditions without losing their essential identity. Unlike Bronze Age empires that had imposed their cultural systems on subject peoples, Phoenician traders learned to work within existing local frameworks while maintaining their own distinct traditions and commercial practices. The alphabet that Phoenician traders carried throughout their networks became one of the most influential innovations in human history, providing the foundation for virtually all subsequent writing systems used in Europe, Africa, and much of Asia. This wasn't just a technological innovation, but a cultural revolution that made literacy accessible to much larger populations than had been possible under Bronze Age writing systems. In the Levant, the collapse of Bronze Age empires created opportunities for smaller peoples who had previously been marginalized by great power competition. The Israelites, Arameans, and other groups developed distinctive cultural and religious traditions that emphasized moral and ethical concerns, rather than the military and administrative preoccupations that had dominated Bronze Age civilization. These new religious and philosophical systems often explicitly rejected the values and practices of Bronze Age imperial culture. Where Bronze Age religions had focused on maintaining cosmic order through elaborate rituals and royal ceremonies, the new traditions emphasized personal responsibility and social justice. Where Bronze Age societies had celebrated military conquest and imperial expansion, the emerging cultures often promoted ideals of peace, cooperation, and mutual aid. The Hebrew Bible, composed during this post-Bronze Age period, contains explicit critiques of imperial power and military violence that would have been unthinkable in Bronze Age royal literature. The stories of David defeating Goliath, of Daniel surviving in the lion's den, and of the Israelites escaping from Egyptian bondage all celebrate the triumph of small peoples over imperial powers, reflecting the experiences of communities that had survived the collapse of Bronze Age civilization. These weren't just literary themes, but practical political philosophies that influenced how post-Bronze Age societies organized themselves and related to their neighbors. The emphasis on law and justice in Hebrew tradition, the focus on wisdom and learning in early Greek philosophy, and the commercial ethics developed by Phoenician traders all represented alternatives to the power-based relationships that had characterized Bronze Age international politics. The gradual recovery of long-distance trade during the early Iron Age operated according to principles that were fundamentally different from Bronze Age commerce. Instead of imperial tribute systems that concentrated wealth in royal treasuries, Iron Age trade networks distributed prosperity more widely among participating communities. Instead of luxury goods produced for elite consumption, Iron Age merchants focused on practical commodities that could improve the lives of ordinary people. Iron tools made agriculture more efficient, allowing farmers to clear new lands and increase crop yields. Better plows, hoes, and harvesting implements enabled communities to support larger populations without requiring the complex irrigation systems and administrative oversight that had been necessary for Bronze Age agricultural intensification. This agricultural improvement provided the economic foundation for population growth and urban development that would characterize the Iron Age world. The revival of urban civilization during the Iron Age followed patterns that were notably different from Bronze Age city development. Iron Age cities were typically smaller and more numerous than their Bronze Age predecessors, reflecting technologies and social organizations that didn't require the massive concentrations of population and resources that had characterized Bronze Age urban centers. These new cities often specialized in particular crafts or commercial activities, rather than trying to recreate the comprehensive administrative and military functions that Bronze Age palaces had performed. A city might become known for its metalworking, its textile production, or its position on important trade routes, developing expertise and reputation that attracted customers and partners from distant regions. The competitive relationships between Iron Age cities encouraged innovation and efficiency in ways that Bronze Age imperial systems had often discouraged. When cities competed for customers rather than controlling them through military force, they had strong incentives to improve their products, reduce their prices, and develop new technologies that would give them advantages over their competitors. This competitive environment fostered rapid technological development that exceeded the pace of innovation during most periods of Bronze Age history. Ironworking techniques improved dramatically as smiths competed to produce better tools and weapons. Agricultural methods advanced as farmers sought to increase their productivity and reduce their costs. Transportation technologies evolved as merchants looked for ways to move goods more efficiently over longer distances. The cultural flowering that accompanied these technological and economic developments produced innovations in art, literature, philosophy, and science that would influence human civilization for millennia to come. The epic poems of Homer, the philosophical investigations of early Greek thinkers, the architectural innovations of Iron Age builders, and the mathematical discoveries of Babylonian astronomers all emerged from societies that had learned to thrive without the imperial structures that had dominated Bronze Age civilization. Yet these achievements weren't simply reactions against Bronze Age culture, but creative syntheses that combined Bronze Age knowledge with new insights and methods developed during the recovery period. The Iron Age world inherited the accumulated wisdom of Bronze Age civilization while developing new approaches to the persistent challenges of human social organization, technological development, and cultural expression. The transformation from Bronze Age imperial civilization to Iron Age commercial and cultural networks represents one of the most remarkable adaptations in human history. Societies that had seemed doomed by the collapse of the systems they had depended on for centuries managed not just to survive, but to create new forms of organization that were more resilient, more innovative, and ultimately more successful than their predecessors. This recovery wasn't achieved through central planning or imperial direction, but through the countless individual decisions of farmers, craftsmen, traders, and thinkers who found ways to rebuild their world from the ground up. Their success demonstrates humanity's remarkable capacity for adaptation and innovation, even in the face of catastrophic system failure that seems to threaten the very foundations of civilized life. The lessons of this transformation would echo through subsequent periods of history, providing models and inspiration for societies facing their own challenges of technological change, political upheaval, and cultural transformation. The Bronze Age collapse had seemed to represent the end of advanced civilization, but it actually marked the beginning of new forms of human achievement that would prove more durable and more adaptable than anything the Bronze Age world had produced. As you settle into sleep tonight, remember that the story of Bronze Age collapse and Iron Age recovery isn't just ancient history. It's a testament to humanity's ability to find new solutions when old systems fail, to create innovation from destruction, and to build better societies on the ruins of those that came before. The Bronze Age gave us our first taste of technological revolution, global trade, and complex civilization. But it also taught us that no system, no matter how successful, is permanent. The real legacy of the Bronze Age isn't the bronze itself, but the human capacity for adaptation that enabled our ancestors to survive catastrophic change and emerge stronger than before. Their story continues in every innovation that improves human life, every trade relationship that connects distant peoples, and every moment when cooperation triumphs over conflict in building the future we all share. All share. The threads of recovery that began weaving together across the ancient world during the early Iron Age would ultimately create a tapestry of human achievement more complex and beautiful than anything the Bronze Age had produced. But this transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't uniform across all regions. Some areas recovered quickly, developing new technologies and social systems within a few generations. Others remained in decline for centuries, their populations scattered and their cultural traditions fragmented beyond recognition. The geographic patterns of this recovery reveal fascinating insights into what made some societies more resilient than others. Coastal regions with access to maritime trade routes generally recovered faster than inland areas that had been more dependent on overland trade networks. Mountain communities that had maintained some degree of self-sufficiency during the Bronze Age often weathered the collapse better than lowland cities that had relied heavily on imported resources. Islands and peninsulas that could control their borders more easily than continental territories frequently developed stable new societies, while their mainland neighbours continued to experience population movements and political instability. The Italian peninsula provides a particularly instructive example of how geographic factors influenced recovery patterns. The mountainous terrain of central Italy had never been fully integrated into Bronze Age trade networks, making local communities more self-reliant than their contemporaries in Greece or Anatolia. When Bronze Age civilization collapsed, these Italian communities possessed the agricultural and metallurgical skills necessary to maintain their way of life without external support. Archaeological evidence from sites like Tarquinia and Veii reveals communities that maintained continuous occupation throughout the Bronze Age collapse period, while developing increasingly sophisticated ironworking techniques. These weren't primitive survivors clinging to subsistence lifestyles, but innovative societies that were actively experimenting with new technologies and social organizations. Their pottery shows clear stylistic evolution rather than cultural stagnation, while their metalwork demonstrates steady improvement in both technique and artistic sophistication. The Etruscan civilization that eventually emerged from these Italian communities would become one of the most successful post-Bronze Age societies, developing urban centers that rivaled anything from the Bronze Age while maintaining greater flexibility and adaptability than their imperial predecessors. Etruscan cities operated as independent city-states that could cooperate when necessary, but weren't bound together by the rigid administrative hierarchies that had made Bronze Age empires vulnerable to systemic collapse. Etruscan innovations in metallurgy, architecture, and political organization would profoundly influence the development of Roman civilization, which would eventually create a new form of imperial system that learned from the mistakes of its Bronze Age predecessors. But that's a story that extends far beyond our Bronze Age journey, demonstrating how the lessons learned during the collapse and recovery period continued to shape human civilization for centuries to come. The religious and philosophical transformations that accompanied the transition from Bronze Age to Iron Age civilization represent some of the most profound changes in human intellectual history. Bronze Age religions had typically focused on maintaining cosmic order through elaborate rituals that reinforced social hierarchies and political authority. The gods of Bronze Age pantheons were often distant figures whose favour had to be earned through expensive sacrifices and complex ceremonies that required professional priestly classes to perform correctly. But the religious systems that emerged during the Iron Age recovery period reflected very different concerns and values. These new traditions often emphasized direct personal relationships between individuals and divine powers, reducing the importance of elaborate institutional hierarchies. They frequently promoted ethical systems that valued justice, compassion, and personal responsibility over military prowess and imperial expansion. The emergence of Hebrew monotheism during this period represents one of the most radical departures from Bronze Age religious thinking. The Hebrew concept of a single, universal God who cared more about moral behavior than ritual performance challenged fundamental assumptions about divine authority and human responsibility that had been central to Bronze Age civilization. This wasn't just a theological innovation, but a complete reimagining of the relationship between spiritual and political authority. Similar transformations were occurring in other parts of the recovering world. Early Greek philosophy began questioning traditional mythological explanations for natural phenomena, seeking rational principles that could explain the workings of the physical world without reference to capricious divine interventions. Persian Zoroastrianism developed ethical dualism that emphasized individual choice between good and evil rather than passive acceptance of divine will. These intellectual developments weren't isolated academic exercises, but practical responses to the challenges of rebuilding civilization after catastrophic collapse. Communities that had watched great empires crumble despite their wealth and power naturally questioned the values and beliefs that had seemed to justify imperial authority. The new religious and philosophical systems that emerged from this questioning process provided alternative frameworks for understanding human purpose and social organization. The technological innovations of the Iron Age extended far beyond metallurgy to encompass virtually every aspect of human life. Agricultural techniques improved dramatically as iron tools made it possible to clear forests, drain swamps, and cultivate marginal lands that had been beyond the reach of Bronze Age farmers. The heavy iron ploughs that became common during this period could break up soil types that bronze implements couldn't handle effectively, opening vast new areas for cultivation. These agricultural improvements supported population growth that enabled the development of more complex societies without requiring the intensive administrative oversight that Bronze Age agricultural systems had demanded. Iron Age farmers could achieve higher productivity with less central coordination, creating economic surpluses that could support urban development and craft specialization without the elaborate bureaucratic apparatus that Bronze Age civilizations had required. Transportation technologies also advanced rapidly during the Iron Age recovery period. Iron tools made it possible to build better roads through difficult terrain, while improvements in shipbuilding techniques enabled more reliable and efficient maritime transportation. The development of standardized weights and measures facilitated trade relationships between communities that had never been in direct contact before, creating commercial networks that operated according to principles of mutual benefit rather than imperial extraction. The alphabetic writing systems that spread throughout the Mediterranean during this period represented another crucial technological breakthrough that democratized access to information and communication. Unlike the complex syllabic scripts used by Bronze Age bureaucracies, alphabetic writing could be mastered by ordinary citizens who weren't professional scribes. This democratization of literacy had profound implications for political development, religious practice, and cultural transmission. When writing was accessible only to specialized scribal classes, it reinforced centralized authority and bureaucratic control over information. But when ordinary people could read and write, they could participate more directly in political decisions, religious practices, and commercial activities that had previously been monopolized by elite groups. This shift toward broader participation in intellectual and cultural life would prove to be one of the most significant legacies of the Iron Age recovery period. The artistic achievements of recovering Iron Age societies reflected their different values and social structures in fascinating ways. Bronze Age art had typically served to demonstrate royal power and divine authority, featuring massive sculptures, elaborate palace decorations, and luxury objects that emphasized the wealth and status of their patrons. But Iron Age art often focused on more personal and intimate themes that reflected the experiences and concerns of broader populations. Greek pottery from this period, for example, shows scenes of daily life, mythological stories, and athletic competitions, rather than the royal ceremonies and military conquests that dominated Bronze Age artistic traditions. This shift reflected not just different aesthetic preferences, but fundamental changes in how societies understood the relationship between individual experience and collective identity. The epic poems that emerged during this period, from Homer's Iliad and Odyssey to the various national epics that developed in other cultures, typically celebrated individual heroism and moral courage, rather than imperial conquest and bureaucratic efficiency. These literary works preserved memories of the Bronze Age world, while reinterpreting them according to Iron Age values that emphasized personal honor, loyalty, and justice over political power and administrative competence. The musical traditions that developed during the Iron Age recovery also reflected the period's emphasis on individual expression and community participation, rather than the elaborate court ceremonies that had characterized Bronze Age musical culture. Folk songs, work songs, and religious hymns became more prominent than the complex liturgical compositions that had been performed by professional musicians in Bronze Age palaces. These cultural developments weren't just artistic innovations, but practical tools for building social cohesion in communities that couldn't rely on traditional sources of political authority. When centralized political systems collapsed, societies needed alternative ways to maintain collective identity and shared values. The artistic, literary, and musical traditions that emerged during the Iron Age recovery period served these functions, while also preserving and transmitting cultural knowledge across generations. The economic systems that developed during Iron Age recovery represented sophisticated adaptations to a world where long-distance trade was more difficult and dangerous than it had been during the Bronze Age peak. Rather than relying on imperial tribute systems or centralized redistribution mechanisms, Iron Age communities developed market-based economies that could function effectively even when political authorities were weak or absent. The development of coined money during this period represented a crucial innovation that made commercial transactions much more efficient and reliable. Bronze Age trade had typically relied on barter systems or standardized commodities like grain or metal ingots that served as media of exchange. But these systems required extensive knowledge of relative values and often involved complex negotiations that made trade relationships cumbersome and time-consuming. Coined money, by contrast, provided standardized units of value that could be easily transported, accurately measured, and widely accepted across different communities. This innovation made it possible for merchants to engage in complex, multi-party transactions without requiring the elaborate diplomatic arrangements that had been necessary for Bronze Age international trade. The banking and credit systems that developed alongside coined money enabled even more sophisticated commercial relationships. Merchants could borrow money to finance trading expeditions, farmers could obtain credit to purchase improved equipment, and craftsmen could invest in workshop expansions that would increase their productive capacity. These financial innovations created economic dynamism that exceeded anything achieved during the Bronze Age period. The competitive markets that emerged during Iron Age recovery encouraged innovation and efficiency in ways that Bronze Age monopolistic systems had often discouraged. When producers had to compete for customers rather than relying on captive markets controlled by political authorities, they had strong incentives to improve their products, reduce their costs, and develop new technologies that would give them competitive advantages. This competitive environment fostered rapid technological development that transformed virtually every aspect of economic life. Iron-working techniques improved dramatically as smiths competed to produce better tools and weapons. Textile production advanced as weavers developed new methods for creating finer fabrics and more attractive colors. Agricultural productivity increased as farmers adopted improved techniques that enabled them to grow more food on the same amount of land. The urban development that accompanied Iron Age economic recovery followed patterns that reflected the period's emphasis on commercial rather than political relationships. Iron Age cities typically developed around marketplaces rather than royal palaces, with residential and workshop areas organized to facilitate commercial activities rather than administrative functions. These commercial cities often enjoyed greater political autonomy than Bronze Age urban centers had possessed, governing themselves through assemblies of citizens rather than royal bureaucracies. This political independence enabled rapid adaptation to changing economic conditions and encouraged experimentation with new forms of social organization that proved more flexible than Bronze Age imperial systems. The international relationships that developed between Iron Age communities operated according to principles that were fundamentally different from Bronze Age imperial politics. Rather than seeking to dominate weaker neighbors through military conquest, successful Iron Age societies typically focused on developing mutually beneficial commercial and cultural relationships that enhanced prosperity for all participants. The Phoenician trading networks that spread throughout the Mediterranean during this period exemplified this new approach to international relations. Phoenician merchants established trading posts and colonies that served local populations while facilitating long-distance commerce, creating relationships based on mutual benefit rather than imperial extraction. This approach proved remarkably successful, enabling Phoenician influence to spread far beyond the geographic reach of any Bronze Age empire. As the Iron Age recovery period progressed, the lessons learned during the collapse and rebuilding process began to influence the development of new forms of political organization that would ultimately prove more durable than their Bronze Age predecessors. The Greek city-states, the Roman Republic, and other Iron Age political systems incorporated features designed to prevent the kind of systemic vulnerabilities that had made Bronze Age empires susceptible to catastrophic collapse. These new political systems typically featured checks and balances that prevented excessive concentration of power, economic policies that encouraged diversification rather than dependence on single resources or trade routes, and military organizations that emphasized citizen participation rather than professional warrior elites. While these systems weren't perfect and would face their own challenges in later periods, they demonstrated humanity's capacity to learn from historical experience and create more resilient institutions. The recovery from Bronze Age collapse represents one of the most remarkable achievements in human history, demonstrating our species' extraordinary capacity for adaptation, innovation, and renewal. The societies that emerged from this period of crisis weren't simply restored versions of what had come before, but genuinely new forms of human organization that incorporated lessons learned through catastrophic experience. Their success in rebuilding civilization on more sustainable foundations provides hope and inspiration for contemporary societies facing their own challenges of technological change, environmental pressure, and social transformation. The Bronze Age taught humanity that no system, however successful, is permanent. But the Iron Age recovery demonstrated that collapse can become the foundation for even greater achievements. As you drift into sleep, surrounded by the quiet darkness of night, remember that you are part of an unbroken chain of human adaptation and innovation that stretches back through the Iron Age recovery, through the Bronze Age collapse, through the first discovery of bronze itself, and beyond to the earliest moments when our ancestors first began the long journey towards civilization. Their struggles and triumphs, their failures and recoveries, their endless capacity for learning and growth, all live on in the world we inhabit today, and the future we continue to create together. The echoes of Bronze Age innovation continue to resonate through our modern world in ways that would astonish the ancient metalworkers who first mixed copper and tin in their primitive furnaces. Every time you use a smartphone with its complex integrated circuits, you're benefiting from metallurgical principles that were pioneered by Bronze Age craftsmen experimenting with alloy compositions. Every time you participate in global trade networks that connect manufacturers in one continent with consumers on another, you're engaging with economic concepts that were first developed by Mesopotamian merchants managing supply chains that stretched from Britain to Afghanistan. The collapse and recovery cycle that defined the transition from Bronze to Iron Age established patterns of human adaptation that have repeated throughout history with remarkable consistency. The fall of the Roman Empire, the collapse of medieval trade networks during the Black Death, the transformation of societies during the Industrial Revolution, and even the digital disruption of traditional industries in our own time, all follow similar trajectories of system failure followed by innovative reconstruction. Understanding these patterns provides crucial insights into the challenges facing our contemporary world. Like their Bronze Age predecessors, modern global systems have created unprecedented prosperity through complex interdependencies that span continents. International supply chains deliver raw materials from dozens of countries to manufacturing centers that produce goods consumed worldwide. Digital communication networks enable instantaneous coordination of activities across vast distances. Financial systems move capital around the globe with speeds that would have seemed magical to ancient traders. But these same interdependencies that create modern prosperity also create vulnerabilities that mirror those that brought down Bronze Age civilization. Single points of failure in critical supply chains can disrupt industries worldwide. Cyber attacks on communication networks can paralyze entire economic sectors. Financial crises in one region can trigger economic downturns that affect populations across multiple continents. The Bronze Age experience suggests that these vulnerabilities aren't necessarily fatal flaws, but natural characteristics of complex systems that can be managed through appropriate adaptation and preparation. The societies that survived Bronze Age collapse weren't those with the most powerful militaries or the most elaborate bureaucracies, but those that maintained flexibility, diversity, and local resilience while participating in larger networks. Modern communities that develop local food production capabilities while participating in global markets, that maintain diverse economic bases rather than depending entirely on single industries, and that invest in education and innovation rather than just consuming existing technologies, are following strategies that proved successful during previous periods of systemic transformation. The technological innovations that emerged during Iron Age recovery also provide models for contemporary challenges. Ironworking succeeded not because it was immediately superior to bronze in all applications, but because it was more accessible, more sustainable, and more adaptable to local conditions. Similarly, many of the most promising contemporary technologies succeed not by being the most sophisticated possible solutions, but by being more democratic, more environmentally sustainable, and more easily adapted to diverse circumstances. Renewable energy technologies, open source software, distributed manufacturing systems, and other innovations that democratize access to advanced capabilities while reducing dependence on centralized control systems reflect the same principles that made Iron Age societies more resilient than their Bronze Age predecessors. The cultural and intellectual achievements of the Bronze Age recovery period offer equally valuable lessons for contemporary society. The alphabetic writing systems, philosophical traditions, and artistic innovations that emerged during this period succeeded because they made previously elite capabilities accessible to broader populations while encouraging individual creativity and local adaptation. Modern educational systems, communication technologies, and cultural institutions that follow similar principles of democratization and decentralization are more likely to foster the kind of innovation and resilience that enabled ancient societies to not just survive catastrophic change, but emerge stronger than before. The religious and ethical developments that accompanied Bronze Age recovery also speak to contemporary needs for meaning and purpose in rapidly changing times. The emphasis on personal responsibility, social justice, and universal values that characterized Iron Age spiritual traditions provided frameworks for understanding human purpose that could survive political upheaval and cultural transformation. Contemporary societies facing similar challenges of technological disruption and social change might benefit from developing ethical frameworks that emphasize human dignity, environmental stewardship, and cooperative problem solving, rather than just economic growth and technological advancement. Perhaps most importantly, the Bronze Age experience demonstrates that catastrophic change doesn't necessarily mean the end of progress or the loss of human achievement. The societies that emerged from Bronze Age collapse ultimately achieved greater prosperity, more widespread literacy, more participatory political systems, and more sophisticated philosophical understanding than their Bronze Age predecessors. Their success wasn't achieved by trying to recreate the past, but by learning from historical experience while developing innovative solutions to contemporary challenges. They preserved what was valuable from Bronze Age civilization while creating new institutions, technologies, and cultural practices that were better adapted to their changed circumstances. The transformation from Bronze Age imperial civilization to Iron Age commercial and cultural networks required generations of patient work by countless individuals who found ways to rebuild their communities, develop new skills, and create better relationships with their neighbors. Their efforts weren't always immediately successful, and many experiments failed before finding approaches that worked. But their persistence and creativity ultimately produced forms of human organization that were more resilient, more just, and more capable of continuous adaptation than anything the Bronze Age world had achieved. Their legacy lives on not just in the specific institutions and technologies they created, but in the demonstration that human societies can learn from failure and create better futures from the ruins of collapsed systems. As you settle deeper into sleep, let the story of Bronze Age rise and fall, remind you that you are part of an ongoing human adventure that has already overcome challenges that seemed insurmountable to previous generations. The same creativity, resilience, and capacity for cooperation that enabled our ancestors to survive Bronze Age collapse and create Iron Age renewal continues to operate in our contemporary world. Every innovation that improves human life, every act of cooperation that builds understanding across cultural boundaries, and every effort to create more sustainable and just forms of social organization carries forward the legacy of those ancient peoples who refused to accept defeat and found ways to build better civilizations from the ashes of the old. The Bronze Age taught humanity that technological advancement alone isn't sufficient to guarantee the survival of civilizations, but the Iron Age recovery demonstrated that human wisdom, creativity, and cooperation can overcome even the most devastating setbacks. Their story continues in every generation that faces its own challenges with courage, learns from past experience with humility, and works toward a future that honors both human achievement and human responsibility. Tonight, as the ancient world fades into dreams and sleep carries you toward tomorrow, remember that the Bronze Age journey from innovation through collapse to renewal represents not just a chapter in human history, but a continuing pattern of growth that shapes our world today and will continue to guide human development for generations yet to come. The metalworkers who first discovered bronze, the merchants who created the first global trade networks, the warriors who built and destroyed empires, the refugees who survived catastrophic collapse, and the innovators who created new forms of civilization all contributed to an ongoing human story that you are helping to write through your own choices and actions. Their legacy lives on in every moment, when cooperation triumphs over conflict, when innovation solves problems that once seemed impossible, and when human wisdom guides technological power toward purposes that enhance rather than diminish the flourishing of all life on Earth. Sleep well, knowing that you carry within yourself the same capacity for adaptation, creativity, and renewal that enabled humanity to survive its first great technological revolution and emerge stronger, wiser, and more capable than ever before. The Bronze Age adventure continues in every sunrise that brings new opportunities to learn, to grow, and to build a future worthy of the extraordinary journey that brought us here. Us here. The dreams that carried our ancestors through those dark centuries, between Bronze Age collapse and Iron Age renewal, were filled with memories of gleaming palaces and distant shores, of bronze weapons catching sunlight, and merchant ships heavy with exotic cargo. But they were also dreams of possibility, of new ways of living that might prove more enduring than the grand empires that had seemed so permanent in their golden age. In the villages that slowly grew where Mycenaean citadels had once stood, children learned stories that transformed the heroes of the Bronze Age into legends that spoke to Iron Age values. The warriors who had once been celebrated for their bronze-armed conquests became figures who triumphed through cleverness and moral courage rather than superior weaponry. The kings who had commanded tribute from distant lands became wise rulers who earned loyalty through justice rather than fear. These weren't conscious attempts to rewrite history, but natural processes by which human communities preserve what serves them while discarding what no longer fits their circumstances. The technological mastery of Bronze Age craftsmen lived on in the skills of Iron Age smiths, who adapted ancient techniques to work with new materials. The administrative wisdom of Bronze Age bureaucrats survived in the record-keeping methods of Iron Age merchants who needed to track complex commercial relationships without imperial backing. The mathematical knowledge developed by Bronze Age astronomers found new applications in Iron Age navigation techniques that enabled merchants to cross open seas without the coastal landmarks that Bronze Age sailors had relied upon. The architectural principles perfected in Bronze Age palace construction influenced the design of Iron Age temples and public buildings that served community needs rather than royal display. But perhaps the most profound inheritance from the Bronze Age was something that couldn't be measured or weighed or counted in any inventory. It was the knowledge that human beings were capable of creating civilizations that could span continents and endure for centuries, that they could develop technologies and institutions that enhanced life for countless generations, and that they could recover from even the most catastrophic failures to build something better than what had come before. This knowledge lived on in the confidence with which Iron Age communities tackled challenges that might have overwhelmed less experienced societies. When early Greek cities faced threats from powerful neighbours, they drew inspiration from stories of Bronze Age heroes who had defended their homes against impossible odds. When Phoenician merchants ventured into unknown waters, they carried with them techniques and traditions that had been tested across millennia of Mediterranean trade. The recovery wasn't uniform or immediate. Some regions remained depopulated and economically stagnant for centuries after the initial collapse. Archaeological sites across Anatolia and the Levant show evidence of settlements that were abandoned and reoccupied multiple times as populations struggled to find sustainable ways of life in the changed circumstances of the post-Bronze Age world. But even these apparent failures contributed to the eventual success of Iron Age recovery by serving as experiments that tested different approaches to the challenges of rebuilding civilization. Communities that tried to recreate Bronze Age social hierarchies without Bronze Age economic foundations typically failed within a few generations. Those that attempted to maintain Bronze Age military technologies without access to international tin supplies found themselves vulnerable to neighbours who had adapted more successfully to Iron Age realities. The lessons learned from these failures spread through the informal networks that connected recovering communities across the Mediterranean world. A farming technique that worked in one valley might be carried by migrating families to another region, where it proved equally successful. A political innovation that enabled one city to resolve conflicts peacefully might be adopted by neighbouring communities facing similar challenges. These knowledge-sharing networks operated very differently from the formal diplomatic relationships that had connected Bronze Age empires. They were based on personal relationships, family connections, and commercial partnerships rather than official treaties and bureaucratic protocols. They were more flexible and adaptable than imperial systems, but they were also more fragile and required constant nurturing to maintain. The religious and philosophical traditions that emerged during this period reflected humanity's attempt to understand the meaning of the catastrophic changes they had witnessed and survived. The gods of the Iron Age were often portrayed as more accessible and responsive to human concerns than their Bronze Age predecessors had been. They were deities who valued justice and mercy rather than just power and wealth, who protected the weak rather than just the strong, who rewarded moral behavior rather than just ritual correctness. These theological developments weren't abstract intellectual exercises, but practical responses to communities that needed divine guidance for unprecedented challenges. When traditional authorities had collapsed and familiar institutions had failed, people naturally turned to spiritual sources for the wisdom and courage needed to rebuild their lives and communities. The epic literature that emerged during Iron Age recovery preserved Bronze Age memories while reinterpreting them according to Iron Age values and concerns. The heroes of these stories typically succeeded not through superior weaponry or imperial backing, but through personal qualities like intelligence, courage, loyalty, and moral integrity that were accessible to ordinary people rather than just elite warriors. These literary traditions served crucial social functions in communities that were rebuilding their cultural identities from fragments of collapsed civilizations. They provided models of heroic behavior that emphasized virtues appropriate to Iron Age circumstances while maintaining connections to the grandeur and achievement of the Bronze Age past. The artistic traditions that flourished during Iron Age recovery reflected the period's emphasis on individual expression and community participation, rather than elite patronage and imperial display. Pottery, metalwork, and textile production often featured decorative motifs that celebrated local landscapes, seasonal cycles, and community activities rather than royal ceremonies and military conquests. This democratization of artistic production enabled much larger populations to participate in cultural creation while developing regional styles that reflected local conditions and preferences. Iron Age art often shows greater diversity and experimentation than Bronze Age court art, which had been constrained by formal protocols and standardized iconographic systems. The technological innovations that accelerated during Iron Age recovery extended far beyond metallurgy to encompass virtually every aspect of human activity. Agricultural tools improved dramatically as iron implements enabled farmers to work more efficiently in challenging soil conditions. Transportation technologies advanced as iron reinforcement made possible stronger wheels, more durable ships, and more reliable road construction. Communication systems evolved as alphabetic writing enabled faster and more accurate transmission of information across long distances. Mathematical and astronomical knowledge expanded as Iron Age scholars built upon Bronze Age foundations while developing new applications for practical navigation, agricultural planning, and commercial calculation. These technological developments created positive feedback loops that accelerated the pace of recovery and innovation. Better agricultural tools increased food production, which supported larger populations, which provided more workers for craft specialization and technological development. Improved transportation systems reduced the costs of trade, which increased commercial profits, which provided capital for further investment in technological improvement. The economic systems that emerged during Iron Age recovery incorporated lessons learned from Bronze Age collapse while developing new institutions that proved more resilient and adaptable than their predecessors. Market mechanisms replaced many of the administrative distribution systems that had characterized Bronze Age economies, creating more efficient allocation of resources while reducing dependence on centralized political control. And so we reach the end of our journey through humanity's first great technological revolution, a story that began with the simple mixing of copper and tin and ended with the birth of the world we recognize today. As you drift deeper into sleep, let this ancient tale remind you that every challenge humanity faces has been faced before, that every collapse has led to renewal, and that the same spirit of innovation and resilience that carried our ancestors through Bronze Age, triumph and catastrophe continues to flow through every generation that dares to build something better from the ruins of what came before.